Care.com's annual child care State of the Union has been released, and the results are staggering, showing that for the first time in history, child care costs are predicted to increase to between $25,000 and $36,000 per child per year in many major metro areas. And that means that costs have increased by 35 to 46% in the last couple years. Now, that has a whole bunch of publications saying that childcare is in chaos. But what if I told you childcare isn't in chaos? That this was the eventuality of a carefully crafted series of executed actions by a group of private equity firms and megacorps that had collectively gotten together and bought up childcare chains quietly from all across the United States over the last decade, while paying lobbyists to carefully steer the ship to exactly where they are. And they're getting ready to cash in big with your children's lives and futures in their hands. If you regularly watch my videos, then you already know that a report recently came out showing that these same private equity firms have caused the deaths of 22,500 senior citizens. That's these kids' grandparents in the last decade through inadequate care, cost-cutting measures, and cutting corners wherever possible. And they're about to do it with your kids. Let's talk about it, and let's figure out what we can do to stop it. After the emergence from the 2008 Great Recession, there were a series of meetings held by a bunch of billionaires and big shot investors that got together to decide what they were going to do to make sure that their future investments were more resilient to recessions. And one of the things that they determined after a series of studies was that they were going to invest in the things that we were emotionally invested in. Things that mattered to us that we would spend money on no matter how bad it got. And one of the reasons that they wanted that was because even if we didn't have the money, if we were emotionally attached to it, we would then borrow money, likely from them, to make sure we could cover those costs. And no matter how high the prices got, we would pay it. Chief among those recommended acquisitions were things to do with our children, our parents, and our pets. Right about then, that's when they started buying up veterinary clinics, nursing care facilities, and then after that, they turned to child care centers. But they did it very quietly, oftentimes going through international intermediaries. The result of those efforts have been the massive consolidation of large sections and segments of the childcare sector with little discussion about it, giving us the illusion of choice while quietly consolidating many brands under one roof so that they could strategically increase the pricing, because no matter where you went, you would see uniform pricing across a number of brands, making it look like we had no other options because we had no other options. This is a graph demonstrating the largest holdings groups for market share of childcare in the United States and around the world. And if you look at who owns what, it is staggering. Partners Group, Roark Capital, Sycamore Partners, Golden Gate Capital, Primavera Capital Group, Apex Partners Group, Glencoe Capital. All of these brands have been systematically consolidated down, creating a storm that has been brewing on the horizon. Now, most of these private equity firms were expecting prices to increase over a longer period of time. However, COVID put all of that into overdrive and created the perfect smokescreen so that they could amp up all of those numbers, and they've been paying lobbyists a ton of money to execute it. Dozens of these major child care corporations have been funneling money to their lobbying arm, the Early Care and Education Consortium, where their publicly facing mission is to advance the interests of child care and early education for children. It all sounds very altruistic, but in reality, their mission has been to get as much money into their pockets as possible, regardless of what it does for our children. While COVID may have come as a surprise to these guys, it didn't take long for them to learn how to exploit it. They sent this lobbying arm to very quickly go to Congress and start advocating fiercely for huge dumps of money into the childcare sector. And what it did was it created a bunch of subsidies that helped to keep childcare centers open as essential workplaces. Now, the subsidies went far beyond the PPPs or the ERCs that like the rest of the small businesses had. The CARES Act put $3.5 billion plus an additional $10 billion towards child care centers. Then the America Rescue Plan put another $39 billion into early childhood education, and the Enhanced Child Tax Credit put $19.5 million into the birth to 5 years group. That meant that they spent $2,820.50 per child in that subsidy alone, allowing for child care. On top of that, the America Rescue Plan Act of 2021 put $24 billion into stabilization funds to help child care centers afford the costs of the pandemic, the increase in labor costs, and the increased supply chain issues. What's happened since then is that the America Rescue Plan Act of 2021 has recently expired. And there were tons of warning signs, people saying that this was going to cause a massive decrease in available centers. But what does that mean? At the same time that these child care centers were being acquired by private equity, they were also acquiring all of the suppliers. They were applying the software companies, the curriculum providers. They were acquiring the food service companies. They were acquiring the people that provide the equipment that they use in the classrooms. As all of those costs have increased, they've been propped up by the government subsidies. Unfortunately, now with those subsidies ending, the more resilient, larger chains are going to be just fine. But the smaller independent home daycare centers that usually service between 8 and 12 children simply won't be able to sustain the costs of the now increased programs and offerings that they need. And now it's projected that 70,000 child care providers are likely to close. 16,000 child care providers have already closed since the subsidies expired just a few months ago. Well, what does that mean for all of the for-profit centers that are owned by private equity? A sudden decline in all of the small individual centers they have no interest in buying because they only want to buy large collections of centers means a fabrication of scarcity that allows them to raise those prices even more. And as hard as their lobbyists had worked to try to get all of those free subsidies pouring in that allowed them to build up tons of debt and buy tons of chains and centers all across the United States, they're spending double that to kill any piece of legislation that would actually make the prices of childcare come down. As you can see, many were outwardly supportive of the child care provisions in Build Back Better. After all, they would stand to benefit somewhat from increased subsidies. However, their priority is making money, not child care affordable or compensating educators well. They've been less supportive of efforts to have the government boost minimum wages or directly engage in providing child care. Our continued profitability depends on our ability to pass on our increased costs, such as labor and related costs, to our customers. If they'd passed this legislation, it could have put downward pressure on the tuition and fees, which could adversely affect our stocks. Just as Build Back Better was about to pass with billions in subsidies to help add additional teachers and subsidize learning and pour money into small daycare centers that would have created immense competition for the big guys while at the same time driving down the cost of childcare, suddenly one senator killed the bill, or at least this part of the bill. Look no further than Senator Joe Manchin. And the New York Times uncovered that a large consortium of all of these major contributors to that lobbying firm I told you about, including Bright Horizons, KinderCare, Primrose, Lightbridge, and Acelero Learning, all made huge donations to Mr. Manchin's campaign fund and his political action committee, Country Roads, the month after he killed the bill. They also hosted a bunch of big fundraising dinners for him. And here we find ourselves on a track that was much faster than they predicted back in 2014 and 2015, where in 2015, people were spending between $6,000 and $8,000 a year on childcare. Now in 2023, we easily surpassed $25,000 in 1 year alone. And now they have our children. If you look up here, there have been several studies that have shown that when private equity gets involved in hospital care, nursing facilities, long-term care, rehab centers, prison systems, education systems, curriculum systems, immediately revenue extraction begins in one direction. The value of everything that's created is funneled in the direction of billionaires and huge millionaire investors. And what's left is a substandard product because they always seek to do more with less, to get more with less. And when it comes to taking care of our children, less is never an acceptable sacrifice in the name of quest for profit. I know this is bleak, but all hope is not lost yet. We still have time to contact our elected representatives and to elect new representatives that aren't taking donations from these billionaires. And I don't want you to think it's one party or the other because they are two wings of the same bird. Private equity donates 51% and 49% respectively between the two parties. They own everyone. We need to lift up young candidates, smart candidates that aren't taking billions of dollars and are still in there to do good. On the other hand, we also still have time to seek out small home daycares and lift up small daycare centers in our community that haven't been acquired by private equity. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and we work together to fight private equity.